So, a very, very warm welcome to all of you in our audience today. I'm looking forward to this session as much as you are. This is a 90-minute session, and the title is Being Comfortable with Your Emotions. At present, we recommend that you turn off all distractions to fully enjoy this session for which we are here, which is about being comfortable with your emotions. So let me introduce our great speaker, Dan Newby. Dan is a global champion for emotional literacy. His approach is based on his work over the past 20 years as a coach, as an author, and a teacher. In his own words, he works with people who serve people all over the world. How beautiful is that, Dan? Dan has authored 4 books on emotions and their application to coaching. With a background in education and an ICF PCC credential, he has spent about 2 decades in ontological coaching, organizational training, and coach training and education. American by birth, Dan and his wife Lucy live in Spain and call it home. Dan's session will focus on the implications of emotional expression and repression and how we can benefit from acknowledging and accepting our emotions. Dan, a very, very warm welcome to you, and we're so looking forward to all that you have to share with us today.
Thank you so much, Priya. So I'm
So I'm going
delighted
to go off the screen, and the screen is yours. All right?
Okay.
I'll be right there.
Thank you. Well, I'm delighted to be here. I appreciate the invitation greatly from the ICF. And what I would like to share today is to talk about my journey and how it might apply to you. So, when I begin working with people in this area, one of the things they often ask me is, why emotions? Why emotional literacy? And there's 2 answers to that question. One answer is about me personally, is that, well, I'm now in my 60s, but when I was in my late 30s and my 40s, one of the things that I experienced were some very difficult years, some very dark years, with a lot of emotions, which now I can name, but then I struggled with, and I wasn't sure what to do with them. So a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear, a lot of confusion, and even a certain amount of resignation, resentment. So these were all emotions that were challenging me to live well. And one of the things that I did during that time was that I was not living in alignment with my values. And I didn't understand why, because, I was really clear what I thought and what I believed. And over time, what I discovered was that, I was emotionally illiterate. I was emotionally ignorant. So I had emotions, but I didn't know what to do with them. And so that got me on the path through curiosity, but also through the emotion of desperation, looking for an answer of how could I understand emotions in a very practical way. So not necessarily through psychology, but as a tool that I could use every day, which led me to the idea through reading and through conversation of emotional literacy. And emotional literacy for me is kind of like linguistic literacy. It's that we can decode something and use it to our benefit. And, with linguistic literacy, we decode language. But with emotional literacy, we can understand and decode emotions, ours and other people's, so that we can use them to our benefit. We can use them as a tool or as a life skill. So that's now my work. So for a long time, I have trained coaches, worked with coaches. I am a coach, but also an author. And I've also worked training in organizations. I've worked with educators, with parents, and even with teens and younger children to help them develop their emotional literacy. So what I'd like to do today is I'd like to present my perspective on emotions. It's an interpretation. It's my interpretation. So I'm not here to tell you the truth. But what I would like to point to is some of the misconceptions that we have about emotions that I believe keep us from embracing them and appreciating them. Towards the end, I'm going to do a coaching demonstration with a volunteer. And the whole point of that is to show you how I apply the concepts that I'll give you at the beginning in a coaching conversation. Now, I don't know this coachee. We just met backstage, but he's going to give me his challenge, and then we're going to explore it. And we're going to see what we uncover, particularly about his emotions and what he knows about emotions, where he is in his relationship with emotions, but also what he might be blind to and opportunities for learning around emotions. So I have a projectionist today. So Priya, I think, is going to run my PowerPoint. And so I'd like to invite her to please put it up and put it on screen mode so we can have a look at it. So the thing that I'm going to talk about today is emotion-centered coaching. And this is an idea that I developed because as I was working with emotions and as a coach and training coaches, people were asking me, well, what are you doing? And I realized that, well, there was a process, but I hadn't articulated the process. So Preeti, can you put this on full screen so we can see it as a presentation? And you might notice at this moment what emotion you're experiencing. It might be curiosity, what's happening. It might be frustration. Why is this so difficult? Right? It might be annoyance. Why aren't we getting on with this presentation? Yeah. So notice your emotions. They're there for you and they're telling you something. They're giving you guidance and they're trying to help you understand what's happening. So the presentation. It might be intrigue. Well, let me share a little bit more about me. So I'm American, as you can tell from my articulation, from my accent. I've also had the opportunity in my life of living in many places. At the moment, I live in Spain. So here I am presenting to you from Spain. So let's move to the first slide. So I'm going to introduce you to this idea of emotion-centered coaching. So the first question, the first thing for us to think about is, well, how do we relate to emotions, or how do we regard emotions? Because one of the things is that every culture, and by culture, I mean not just ethnic culture, but our social culture, the people that we move with, our family, we all have biases towards or against emotions in general. So let's go through these one at a time. First of all, in my experience with people from all parts of the world, is that emotions tend to be seen or considered as inferior to intellect. And we put tremendous energy into developing our intellect. Most of our education is focused on our intellect, on our cognitive skills. We don't pay attention to emotions. And when we're trying to figure something out, or when we're planning, we turn to intellect, right? We don't think so much about the emotions involved. We really focus on our intellect and what we're thinking and how we're reasoning. We also put more attention on our physical well-being and recovery than emotional. If you stop and think about the systems that we put in place with doctors and hospitals and clinics and pharmaceuticals, is we put tremendous focus on physical well-being and recovery far more than emotional. In fact, the emotional part, I would say, is just a tiny fraction of what we've invested in our physical well-being. Another thing is that in every culture, and again, I mean organization, family, ethnic group, nationality, religion, is that certain emotions are privileged. That means we accept them, we think they're good. And other emotions are discouraged or even banned sometimes. We're told we shouldn't feel that emotion. So here's the thing that I see in general about us as human beings, is that the relationship that we have had with emotions is that we tend to be in certain emotions when we view our emotions, and we tend to view our emotions from suspicion and embarrassment rather than curiosity and acceptance. And my question is, why? And is that really helpful, or is there another possibility? So let's go on. So you think about, what did you learn and what are you immersed in culturally around emotions? So let's go to the next slide and talk about what happens when we avoid emotions. Well, I'm just going to give you some general guidelines. So what happens when we avoid emotions is, and you can find this easily in searches online, that a growing number of studies from universities, including Harvard Medical and National Institutes of Health and other sources, show a correlation between emotional repression, or not acknowledging our emotions or ignoring our emotions, and a whole list of things that challenge us physically and emotionally. They challenge our well-being. So let's put the list up. First of all, digestive issues. We know this, right? We feel a lot of anxiety and we get an upset stomach. Depression is somehow related to certain emotions. Heart disease is often related to specific emotions. Poor sleep, we've all had that experience, or an inability to relax and rest. I don't know if you've had this experience, but I have. After being in the emotion of ambition and then going to the beach, it's actually quite difficult to give myself permission to rest. So certain emotions, when we don't pay attention to them, when we don't know how to work with them, produce all of these: sexual and relational dysfunction, fatigue, and many more. So just that list for me is a great reason to begin to think about, okay, how could we change our relationship with emotions? How can we pay more attention to them? So I want to share my belief and my vision. My belief is that many of the biggest challenges we face, and the small challenges, both individually and collectively, can be resolved through increased emotional literacy. I personally have this experience from my own journey, and finding that emotional literacy helped me understand myself better, but it also vastly changed my relationship with other people, my ability to listen, my ability to interact with others. So here's my vision. Here's what I'm hoping for. Here's what I'm working towards, is that a world in which emotions and emotional literacy are considered common sense. We don't see them as something embarrassing or as something to hide, but we see them as a skill and a tool in the same way that we embrace linguistic literacy today. And I believe it's entirely possible. This is what I'm always aiming for with my clients. So let's take a little tour through history. You know that emotions, the way we understand them, is our interpretation. So we have a certain way of seeing emotions. But if you go back in history, or if you look at any culture in the world, here's what you'll see, is that that group has tried to make sense of emotions in some way. So let's look first at the Greeks. Well, the Greeks had a very somatic interpretation of emotions. They thought they thought emotions stemmed from and were influenced by our digestive system. And they talked about white bile and black bile. They talked about the humors, which is where we get our word mood, where that's the interpretation that they used. And I can remember learning about this and thinking, well, that's odd. That doesn't make sense to me. But if you were Greek and you think about them trying to make sense of emotions, well, that's the way it made sense to them, because they could feel it in their body. And they noticed that when they changed what they ate, when they changed what they drank, it shifted their emotions and their moods. So if we move ahead to the Romans had a very different interpretation. They connected emotions with the gods. And we still use this in many cultures. At Valentine's Day, we wheel out Cupid. And who is Cupid? Cupid is that little angel, right, who shoots an arrow through your heart, you fall in love. Well, that's a holdover from the Romans, because the Romans believed that the gods were influencing humans to do what they did by manipulating their emotions and making them feel greed, or making them feel envy, or making them feel joy. So the Romans had a very different interpretation from the Greeks. And then if you move to other areas, you'll find that certain cultures tended to have an idea about emotions, that they were something dark, they were a dark force, and that they were caused or they were provoked in us by demons or by a devil in some way. But moving to today, well, we've had our own interpretation. And what's our own interpretation? Well, it's been quite psychologically based, meaning that if we wanted to have a serious conversation about emotions, we needed to do it with somebody who was trained in psychology or in therapy or in counseling. All of that's fantastic. And I think it's a wonderful application of emotions. I've benefited from it personally. But here's what I would like to see. Here's what I'm looking for. Is I'm suggesting an interpretation of emotions that allows them to be seen as a practical tool and a life skill. So something we can teach every single child, we can teach every single person, and we can use it like we would use reading and writing, or like we would use arithmetic. It would just become one of those tools we use every day, rather than seeing it as something scary or something embarrassing or something to be avoided. So those are the human interpretations. There's many more that we could find if we studied. But now the question is, or the image I'd like to plant with you is this. Imagine the relationship between culture and food. Let's look in a different territory. So, first of all, we were taught culturally to either explicitly or implicitly what to eat and what not to eat, right? You remember this growing up. We were also taught or shown through modeling when to eat, how to eat, what order in which to eat things, which foods to combine or not combine. In other words, we were taught about food, what is normal in terms of nourishment. Now, if we go explore other cultures, one of the things that we're likely to find is that our way of eating, our relationship with food is not positive. It's not inherently right or wrong. We learned about food in a very practical sense, but the food that we eat, we may find that it's a matter of our culture, our history, our faith, or our preferences. And that can open us up to lots of new possibilities in terms of food and eating and nourishment. And I would argue the same thing about emotions, right? Emotions are not inherently good or bad or right or wrong, but our family, our culture, our friends, our organization has a certain relationship with emotions that if we take a look at it, we may find that it's quite limiting. And my invitation is, well, let's expand. Let's take a look outside of our traditional way of looking at emotions. So what happens when we avoid emotions? Well, let's go back to the food comparison. If our attention on what and how we consume has a long-term impact on our well-being, and we know this is why we have diets. This is why we sometimes try to modify what we're eating, because it's not serving us. It's undermining our well-being. The same with emotions, right? Attention on our emotions and how we live them has the same impact. Attention on our emotions and the ability to regulate them effectively likewise impacts our well-being. Again, many studies that you can find that tell us this. So here's my question to you. And if you want to write something in the chat, it would be lovely. But growing up, you were taught, or you learned about, or you made meaning of emotions in an attempt to understand them. You looked at the people around you, you saw how they lived their emotions, and you probably adopted that. So the question is, what did you learn? Or what were you taught? And I'd love to see some people write in the chat, like, what is it, if you could articulate it very simply, what is it that you were taught about emotions? Anything specific you can remember about emotions? What you heard people saying about emotions, what people taught you specifically about emotions. Okay. Well, let's go on because I was taught not to show anger, that it's disrespectful. Okay, that's what you were taught. That's what you learned. You learned that being angry or shy is not encouraged. You learn not to demonstrate emotions openly. You learn that exhibiting emotions was seen as a sign of weakness. Right? Adult men
Yeah,
should not cry in public. Yes,
right.
Priya.
Yeah, there's so many lovely insights coming in here about what they've been, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
share your emotions if you want to feel light. Boys should not cry.
Yep.
That's a typical one. Do not show emotions at work. It's an abstract thing. Don't be vulnerable in public.
Yeah.
Boys are more naughty, and emotions are not always rational. Showing emotions was seen to be weak. Yes,
Yep.
Aparna, so true.
Yep. So we could go on, but
Yeah,
I want to summarize these because I hear the same things over and over from people in every part of the world. So let's go through. I've got 9, I would call them misconceptions or myths. So let's go to the first one and see how these square with what you learned about emotions. The first one is that many people have the belief that emotions can be avoided, right? We run away from them. We try not to feel them. But if you think about a different interpretation, it could be this: it's that emotions are non discretionary. We don't have a choice. We are emotional beings. And emotions are nothing more than the energy that moves us. That's what the original meaning of the word emotion was. So, one thing that's important, or one thing that can be valuable, is to begin to accept that, okay, I am an emotional being. I can't get rid of them. So maybe if I learned about them, that would be more helpful. That would move me forward in life rather than me spending all this energy fighting with them and trying to get rid of them. The second myth or common belief is that emotions can't be learned. Many people say, well, that's just the way I am. Well, actually, I would say maybe it's the way you learn to be. Maybe it's not just the way you are, because all of us have been learning since we were born. If you couldn't learn emotionally, you would have the same emotional range and capability, capacity as a child, as when you were born. So clearly you have been learning emotionally. What I would argue is that you may not know how you learn emotionally, but there's evidence we can look for, which is that you have been learning emotionally. The third myth, or the third common belief that I think keeps us from engaging with emotions, is we have a belief that emotions are random. They just show up whenever they want to show up. They're capricious. They do whatever they want to do, and they can't be trusted. And I would argue something very differently. I would say that emotions have a logical structure. Every emotion is telling us something, it's giving us information. Every emotion has an impulse for us to be in action or to stop being in action. And every emotion for me has a purpose. Well, that's quite logical. Emotions are also predictable reactions to experiences. Sadness is the reaction we have when we believe we've lost something we care about. Even if we haven't lost it, just the fact that we believe we've lost it will produce sadness. Well, that's predictable, because what we know then is every time we lose something that we care about, we will feel sad. So for me, it's a predictable reaction to an experience. Now, what's not predictable, in my view, is what experiences we'll have next. If we could predict what experiences were coming, then we would know what emotions we're going to probably need to deal with. And the third is that emotions can be trusted to inform and guide us. We can be misguided by emotions, but we can also be misguided by our thinking. We can be misguided by our body, the sensations in our body. So for me, I would say that, well, emotions we can trust them much more than we do. Would I ever trust them implicitly without relying on my thinking or my sensations, my body, my intuition? No, but they can be trusted much more than we've learned, because we've been actively taught to distrust them. The fourth common belief or myth that I encounter everywhere is that emotions are inherently positive or negative, that we can name what are all the positive emotions and what are all the negative emotions. But here's what I would argue is that any emotion can either serve us or it can be a barrier. If we take an emotion like fear, fear is often seen as a negative emotion, but fear keeps us safe. Fear keeps us looking both ways when we cross the street. Fear keeps us from taking too much risk. So that's actually pretty good. But on the other hand, fear can keep us from doing things we really want to do. Well, that's not so good. So fear, I would argue, is not in and of itself necessarily positive or negative. It allows us to do certain things. It keeps us from doing certain things. And the question that I'm always interested in is it serving us in this moment? And if it is, great. And if it's not, then what are we going to do about it? Common belief or myth number 5 for me is that emotions exist just to irritate or annoy us. I used to believe this one absolutely. When I was struggling in the time I mentioned, I hated emotions. I thought if I could just get rid of emotions, life would be good. But in fact, here's the thing I would say about emotions. What I've learned is that every emotion has a purpose, or it exists to take care of us in some way, or it allows us to do something we could not do. So it doesn't exist for no reason. Sadness tells us what we care about. If I just think about my wife, who I do care about, dying, I'll feel sad. What does that tell me? It tells me I care about her. So it doesn't even have to have happened for sadness to show me its purpose. But we can take any emotion and we can do the same thing with it. We can ask ourselves, why am I experiencing that emotion? What's the purpose of that emotion? And why am I experiencing it right now? The purpose is essential for us to understand if we want to build our emotional literacy. Common belief or myth number 6 is that emotions can be controlled and we must try to control them to live well. Well, I've been doing this work for quite a while and I can't control my emotions. I've never had anybody show me how. So here's my proposal. My proposal is that relationship should be we should be a little skeptical maybe, or we should challenge that relationship, that way of thinking about emotions. I would argue that emotions cannot be controlled, but we can learn ways to navigate them. Meaning that if I'm experiencing an emotion and it's not appropriate for me to express it, okay, I can save it for later and I can then decide how to respond from it. I can also choose emotions that will allow me to have difficult conversations or be in situations that might provoke less useful emotions. So my suggestion is that we rethink this relationship with emotions. We quit trying to control them and we more form a partnership. We befriend them. We begin to look at them as something that supports us in life, but we need to know more about it before it can do that. Common belief or myth number 7, and we're getting to the end of these, but emotions get in the way of clear thinking, and by nature, they're in conflict with reason. And if you know anything, and I just know a little bit about neuroscience, but here's what I understand now, is that emotions are an integral part of thinking and reasoning, is that in different emotions, we think differently or we reason differently. So it's a little simplistic to believe that we can separate emotions and thinking. And if you stop and imagine you were, I don't know, designing a music show. Well, if you design that from the emotion of resentment, or from the emotion of joy, you will design it differently, right? You'll think about it differently. So I think we can all find situations in which we can see this in our lives day to day, is that these two things are connected. And if we want to change the way we think, then one place to begin is with our emotions. What are the emotions that are generating that particular way of thinking? Common belief number 8. Now, this I don't say is a myth. And the reason is because there's been an explanation put out that there are only 6 core emotions and the rest represent varying degrees of intensity. An emotions wheel, for instance. And I think that's lovely. It's very helpful as a beginning place to understand emotions. But here's what I want to propose to you is that once you move past that, there's a way to think about emotions as that there's more than 200 and they're absolutely unique. Is that anger is not the same as annoyance, frustration, irritation, or even sadness. These are all distinct, unique emotions. And here's the analogy I would use. The analogy is to think about a piano. So imagine a piano keyboard. And here's the similarities, is that every key on a piano keyboard has a unique pitch. It vibrates differently according to physics. And every emotion also, we vibrate differently according to physics. So the first thing is that every emotion, if we see it, is exactly like a key on the keyboard. So although they may be very close, sometimes we might even confuse them, they're still unique and distinct and telling us something different. Some emotions we employ often, just like some keys on the keyboard. We play them in every song. But some emotions are quite rare. For instance, rage or anguish. Those are emotions we typically don't experience every day, but we still need to understand them. We still need to know about them so that when we do experience them or we do need them in that particular piece of music, they're available. The volume of an emotion does not determine the emotion. Sometimes we think that, well, anger is always a loud emotion, but I would say not necessarily. In anger, we can turn a cold shoulder. We can ignore people. So anger can be very loud. We can scream and shout, or it can be very quiet, but it's still anger. And for me, this is lovely to be able to see is that, so emotions are not determined by their volume either, being loud or quiet. They can be played singly, meaning we can have one emotion at a time, but also many times we feel several emotions at the same time. And we may say we feel emotionally conflicted or confused. We talk about love-hate relationships. Well, that makes sense. In one way, we love this person, in another way, we hate this person. But one does not deny or cancel out the other. So we can feel emotions in what I call clusters. And one of the things, if we're going to learn about emotions, is to learn to distinguish what are the emotions that form that cluster so we can understand all the messages that we're receiving. Some emotions are consonant and others are dissonant, meaning some feel great and others feel terrible. But that does not determine whether it's a positive or a negative emotion. And this is a confusion that we often have about emotions. We say we feel bad. Well, actually, what I would suggest is that feeling, that sensation that we experience with an emotion is its way of getting our attention. If we didn't feel the big energy of anger, if we didn't feel exuberance and joy as big emotions, we would miss them. We wouldn't pay attention to them. So they're kind of the signaling device of the emotions to get our attention. But they don't necessarily have anything to do with whether the emotion is beneficial for us or not. This is something for us to learn, is to step away from the judgment about emotions. So this is the piano analogy. I invite you to take a look at it, to think about it, and to think about how it relates to the way you experience emotions. So let's talk a little bit about how do emotions shape our choices? Because my proposal is that specific emotions determine, first of all, what we do. So emotions like curiosity and boredom and wonder, their role is to determine what we do. If we're curious, we investigate more, we ask questions. If we're bored, we go find something else to do. If we're in wonder, we sit and imagine how the thing could happen. They also certain emotions determine how we do it. So, do we act out of service, out of compassion, out of impatience? And there's many more that we could put into this category. There's also emotions that drive why we do what we do. Do we feel empathy? Do we feel pity? Do we do it out of respect for someone? Again, a long list of emotions here that determine why we do things, who we do it with. Do we feel trust? Do we feel loyalty? Do we enjoy being with the person? These are emotions that focus on who do we have relationships with. If we hate the person, we don't do things with them. And even if we do it at all, so we do things from enthusiasm, which for me is a connection with a higher purpose. We do things out of faith because we believe, whether we have evidence or not, we still believe that it's important. Complacency, well, things are good enough. I don't really need to put more energy into this. So these are ways, and we could categorize all 200 emotions into something like this to show their role. They shape our choices and what we do in life. But there's something else they do. They have an impact on our experience and how we engage with the world. And here's another set of examples. Some emotions draw us closer to others. So, for instance, affection. I enjoy being with a person, I enjoy their energy. Admiration, I look up to someone. Curiosity, I want to know more about that person. And then certain emotions distance us from other people. So suspicion, ooh, I don't know if they're telling the truth. I don't know if I should believe them. Hate, right? I wish them ill. I don't want to be around them. Disgust, I feel revulsion at that person. Some emotions give us a sense of strength. For instance, boldness, dignity, adventurousness, right? If you think about when you embody those emotions, you feel stronger, you feel bigger. Some emotions expand our vision. Enthusiasm, like I said, wonder. We look at a bigger world. We see things that we didn't notice before or that we have no understanding of. Intrigue, right? We want to dig into it more. And some emotions serve to narrow our vision. So, ambition, we get focused on the objective and we march forward. Skepticism, we focus on what do we believe? Do we believe what I always believed about emotions, or do I believe what Dan's telling me now? That's skepticism. We're trying to decide what we believe. Urgency, right? We focus on getting it done right this moment because otherwise something bad may happen. So there's many ways in which we can look at emotions, but from any perspective, from any angle, I would say that every aspect of life is influenced by one or more emotions. There's nothing we do that doesn't have an emotion at the core of it, at the root. But we need to stop and notice, what is that? What is that energy we feel? Is it pulling me forward? Is it a barrier in some way? I need to spend time with my emotions, reflect on them, and be curious about them. So let's talk just a little bit about what is this emotional literacy thing that I'm talking about. So here's a quote: to be able to handle emotions in a way that improves your personal power and the quality of your life, and equally important, the quality of the life of the people around you. Emotional literacy helps your emotions work for you instead of against you. And this was written by Claude Steiner. Claude Steiner was a French-American psychologist. He wrote this in the 1990s in a book called Emotional Literacy. And his proposal is very much like mine, is that emotional literacy helps us live life better. It improves our quality of life, but more than that, it also connects us with everyone around us. Here's another quote. What's the relationship to EQ, or emotional intelligence? And the quote is this: emotional literacy lets us sort out all of those feelings we have, name them, and begin to understand their cause and effect. In essence, it's the building block of emotional intelligence. Well, this was written by Joshua Freeman, who is the CEO of 6 Seconds, that creates, has a lovely EQ assessment. But something similar has been written by Daniel Goleman and many other people who study emotional intelligence, is that EQ, or emotional intelligence, and emotional literacy are actually two parts of the same thing, or emotional literacy lives within emotional intelligence. So here's a model. Here's the model I use to help me understand how these fit together. If we want to think about linguistic literacy and emotional literacy, okay, let's take intellect first. So let's build this model. Okay, IQ, that's how we identify our potential, our intellectual potential. EQ, this is how we identify or articulate our emotional capacity, our emotional. If we want to build linguistic literacy as an access to our intellect, we learn the alphabet, right? From the age of 1 or 2 or 3, children are taught the alphabet. They have a song they sing. And then using that alphabet, they move into reading and they move into writing, right? And they become linguistically literate. And just for a moment, stop and think about what linguistic literacy allows you. You can read these slides. You can read a menu. You can read a text. You can write an email. Imagine what life would be like if you were not linguistically literate. At this point, about 85% of human beings have some level of linguistic literacy, according to things that I've read. Wow, that's a pretty high percentage. Let's look at emotional literacy now. How do we build emotional literacy? Well, the first thing is we have to learn to notice and name our emotions. So we need to stop. We need to reflect. We need to be curious about what is that energy that I'm feeling. And then we need to learn to put a name on it, which is much more difficult than it sounds. The next thing we need to learn to do is we need to connect and imagine what's the story that's connected with that emotion. What's its impulse? What's its purpose? And when we get really good at that, then we can say we're emotionally literate. According to this, I would say, in the people I work with, that actually a tiny percentage of us as human beings are emotionally literate or emotionally fluent. I would say we're at the very beginning. We're at the same place with emotional literacy that we were with linguistic literacy 200 years ago. I would say we have work to do in this area. So, what are the steps? If you want to become emotionally literate, here are the steps. Step number 1 is you need to learn how to notice. You need to notice your feelings, the sensations in your body. You need to notice what you're thinking. You need to learn to listen internally to what you're experiencing without judgment. Okay, that's what I'm experiencing. Whether I like it or not, that's the experience I'm having. And then you need to learn to name, to put a name on that experience you're having. And again, most of us have a very small emotional vocabulary. We use the same 15 or 20 words to articulate our emotions over and over and over, but there are more than 200. So imagine we're only using 10% of our potential emotional articulation. Incredible, right? And we tend to call lots of things anger or anxiety when in fact they're not those at all. That's just a convenient label to put on them. We need to know emotions, meaning we truly need to understand these aspects of them. The story, the impulse, the purpose. We need precise distinctions. And this is something that takes time, it takes memorization, it takes observation, but we all can build this knowledge base about our emotions. And the fourth step, the ultimate goal for me, is that we learn to navigate using our emotions. Meaning, if an emotion is not serving me, once I recognize it and name it, I know how to shift to another emotion. If I'm facing a situation that I can predict is going to provoke an emotion that's not particularly useful, then what emotion might I select that would help that situation be smoother or more productive? This is something we can learn to do. But again, most of us get as far sometimes as naming our emotion, but we actually don't know much about them. And very few of us are really good at using emotions to navigate through life. So lots of possibilities here. So let's go to the next slide. I think that this slide shows This shows emotion-centered coaching. So if you would put up also the bullets, is that emotion-centered coaching, and I don't know if you can see it in this model, but it's a coaching model. It's like all coaching models, right? We're listening to the coachee, we're trying to help them reframe or see into their breakdown or their challenge, to see new possibilities and to choose practices or actions that might help resolve that challenge. So we're trying to help them get on a new path. And emotion-centered coaching is no different. But if you look at point number one, it's essential. We're not focusing on the story of the coachee. We're focusing on what's the emotion producing that story. So if someone says, it's really unfair, ooh, that's the emotion of resentment. And then the question is, well, is the resentment serving the coachee, or is it a barrier to them moving forward? Once we resolve that, then we can begin to take steps to help them resolve their challenge. The second thing we need to do is we need to clarify how the coach understands that emotion. Let's take resentment. What does resentment mean to that coachee? Because we all have different interpretations. And it's not that I have the right interpretation, but if I'm going to coach someone, we need to share an interpretation. What does resentment mean? And that takes some conversation. That takes them sharing what it means to them, me sharing what it means to me, and us coming to an agreement. The third is that, or the fourth is that we need to explore if that emotion is serving them or not. Many people, because they feel uncomfortable in a certain emotion, would like to get rid of it immediately. But that's not necessarily useful. Sometimes being in sadness is informing us. It's doing its work. It's actually helping us, even though it's uncomfortable. And the same can be said for any emotion that we find a bit uncomfortable. So the question is it serving them or not? And if it's serving them, great. Then how do they commit to stay there to benefit from that emotion? And if it's not, what are they going to do about it? So then the question is, what emotion out of that list of 200 might serve them better than the emotion they're caught in? And this is not predictable from a coach. For me, when I ask somebody this question, I have no idea what they're going to tell me. And I'm often surprised because it's not the emotion I would have chosen, but it means something to them. They see the possibility of it. And so that's where we're going to go. And the last step is like in every coaching conversation, we co-design actions or practices that will help the coachee strengthen that particular emotion that they want to move to, or to remain in the emotion that they're in. So there's a very practical part of this that we need to not overlook, because if we do, then actually we've just had a nice conversation about emotions, but nothing will shift for the coachee. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to invite Xuan onto the stage, and I'm going to do a coaching with him. We're going to ask that he gets made big and turn off the presentation. Xuan?
Hi, Dan.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, thank
Yes,
you for the
okay.
opportunity.
You're welcome. And am I saying your name correctly?
Yes.
Okay, so very good. Well, so we're not going to talk about what is coaching. You're a coach, so we're with a group of coaches. Mainly what I want to invite you is to share with me why did you volunteer? What's your challenge or dissatisfaction? What would you like us to take a look at from the perspective of emotions today?
Yes, I would like to share a challenge with you.
Okay.
I have this leadership challenge,
Okay.
and I'm heavily involved in the IT industry.
Uh-huh.
And the past few years has been difficult, not just me and many of my colleagues.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that one of the commitment I have is to empathize the situation they have at
Okay.
home, in office. And the challenge is sometimes I have negative emotion towards those are, let's say, being viewed by me of not putting enough effort.
Okay.
So I'm struggling between empathizing their situation and viewing them in some negative light because they seem to be not putting enough effort.
Okay. So let's stop there. That's lovely. Thank you. So you've talked about two sets of emotions, right? One is empathy and the other is this, what you're calling negative emotions. But let's start with empathy and tell me, so what does empathy mean to you? What, as an emotion, how would you describe empathy?
Empathy for me is because I have gone through a lot. I believe I have a lot of experience, and sometimes the situation asks me to see the situation from the other party perspective,
Okay.
like the change that we have.
Okay.
And yeah,
Okay. And tell me, why is it important for you to empathize or feel empathy with the people on your team?
for example, I'm single, so for my colleague who have family, I would not know their struggle, and
Okay.
therefore sometimes I feel that they're not putting enough effort, and possibly they have other situation.
Okay. So you make certain assumptions if you don't
Yes.
feel empathy. Okay. So let's talk about the negative emotions then. So tell me, so negative is the way, we speak about them sometimes, but can you articulate specific emotions that you're calling negative?
Sometimes I feel contempt.
Contempt. Okay. And what is contempt?
Contempt. Yes.
And what is contempt?
It's like look down upon.
Okay. You look down on them. Okay. Is that the only emotion?
Angry. Angry definitely quite
Okay.
angry.
And anger, why anger?
Because it seems that I'm powerless. Because if I empathize that situation, I'm powerless.
Okay. Okay. Any other emotions that fall into this category of negative?
Maybe I a bit jealous what they have, and I have to put in the effort.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. You feel a
Yes,
little
that
jealous.
it's the other side of
Yeah. Or envious that their situation is their situation and you don't have it. Okay. Lovely. Anything
Yes.
else?
Or maybe as a consequence, I feel beside powerless, also frustrated, right?
Okay. Yep. And what does frustration mean to you?
It seems that we are in a very difficult position. Like I want to empathize at the same time, there's certain demand on us that to perform or deliver certain outcome.
Okay.
And I feel kind of like between hard rock and difficult place.
Okay.
Yeah.
So between a rock and a hard place. Yep. Okay. So let me share what I'm
That's what
hearing.
I experienced so far.
Okay. So let me share what I'm hearing. I'm hearing that in the course of your work is that you are feeling some contempt and anger and jealousy or envy and frustration.
Yes.
Yeah. And it sounds like maybe the solution you see from an emotional perspective is empathy. If you could just feel more empathy, then you wouldn't feel these other emotions. So, what I hear is you feel these four emotions you've listed as negative, and you believe, I think, what you're telling me is that more empathy is what you need to resolve those four emotions? If you could just be more empathic or empathetic.
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's one possibility. Yeah. But what other emotions might serve you better than empathy? Right? If you stop and think about what are all the other possibilities, if it wasn't empathy, if it was some other emotion, might actually help you more than empathy.
I think the other thing I can definitely try is to open about my emotion, because they may not know how I feel.
Okay.
Yeah, especially the negative emotion.
Okay. And how might you do that?
By sharing what I observe and what trigger in me by that observation.
Okay. And how do you think that would help? Why do you think that would be helpful?
Because I'm keeping this emotion inside, the other party doesn't know. First, they don't know. Secondly, it may not seem to be what I have observed or what I have interpreted.
Okay.
It's possible that they just say that if you feel that way, we can work together to make some little tweak or change.
Okay. So underneath what you just said, am I hearing curiosity that maybe, oh, maybe I'm not understanding correctly their situation, and I might ask questions.
Yes.
Okay. So curiosity might be a possibility. Think about what emotion you would need in order to share your emotions or share your observations. What emotion would allow you to do that?
I think definitely one of them is I need to feel courageous.
Okay. And why
Because
courage? Yeah.
because it may show me that I'm not as see what they seem to know about me.
Okay. Because somebody might judge you or might think less of you. Yeah, okay. So
Yes.
courage. What other emotion might be helpful for you if you wanted to share your observation with your team? You might need some courage, but what else might you need?
I want to say being vulnerable.
Okay. And what is
Being vulnerable.
and what is being vulnerable? What does it mean to be vulnerable?
I may not know all the answer because of the difficult position that we are in.
Okay. That actually kind of sounds like honesty.
Yes, I'm honest, but I'm not verbalizing it. So it's like I need to verbalize it so that they
Yeah.
know that the difficult position that I'm experiencing, but may not
Yeah.
be what they have experienced.
Okay. So maybe just some honesty. This is the situation. This is what I know. This is what I don't know. Yeah. And, vulnerable in the sense that, sure, somebody might think less of you. Somebody might make fun of you or, you know, yeah, people often judge other people. And of course, somebody might do that. With your team, do you
Yeah.
think that that's a risk with your team, or do you think it's more internal for you? Do you think it will truly put you
Generally,
at
it's more internal for me because the experience gap we have is at least 10 years.
Okay. Yep. But you haven't done it before. So, one of the emotions that
I'm the
shows
most
that,
senior person in the team.
sure. So it sounds like maybe a little bit of fear. right? Something bad might happen. Ah, lovely. So if you're watching, you might think about, wow, what are the emotions you're seeing? What's the connection between them? How are we teasing out and moving forward in this conversation? What might you
Dan, can
ask
you repeat
next?
the last sentence?
Sure. So it sounds like maybe a little bit of fear that something bad might happen
Yes.
if you share. Yeah. But
Yes.
sometimes we confuse fear with doubt. And doubt is when we haven't done it before, so we don't really know how it's going to turn out. Right? We're doing something new. We're doing something for the first time, and we're unsure, how are people going to react to it? So I'm curious if what you're feeling is more doubt or more fear.
I think so far it's more doubt because I have never tried before.
Okay. Yep. And what's interesting about doubt is we can't really resolve doubt until we've done the thing, whatever the thing is, right? That's how we resolve doubt. We do it and then we see the result. Yeah. So we can do it with certain emotions like prudence. We can do it carefully, right? Or with caution, a little bit at a time. Yeah. So we don't necessarily need to take a big risk, but doubt itself is telling us to prepare. That's the purpose of doubt. Get out the map and see where you're going. Check check on your information. Be sure you know. Don't assume. So tell me how this might work. Okay, I hear you saying maybe a little bit of curiosity, a little bit of courage, a little bit of honesty, paying attention to the doubt, right? That maybe that would take the place of empathy. Maybe that would be a better solution emotionally than trying for empathy. Yeah. So what are you thinking?
I think what I hear from you is, what might I try? Is that what you're asking?
I'm asking you, what might you try?
I think since we replace fear with doubt, and doubt can only be resolved through the first step, I would think that, yes, since we replace the word fear with doubt, I might talk to someone I feel confident with within the team and see whether they share the same opinion or they have different interpretation.
Okay. And share, what would you be sharing with them?
On a second thought, the first thing that I share seemed to be safe. At the same time, it looked pretty bad as a leader because that creating small talk. I would think that it's a time that I need to be open and honest.
Okay.
With the team.
And what would that look like?
So I feel that after this conversation, I feel that it's calling me. So what I'm trying to share is, in a second thought, having a conversation with certain members seem to be creating a small talk or small circle. And I think it's a time for me to be open and honest and talk to the team directly.
Okay. And what would you say to the team?
I will probably follow what you said. Start with notice, what I notice. What I notice, and then naming the interpretation or the feeling that I have. And see whether are we on the same page or we are different.
Okay. And what's the interpretation that you have that you're going to share?
I will first share the observation, like the outcome that we have or the result we have so far, and some of the incident that I have observed, and I will share with them the hard and the rock, the hard place and the rock, and maybe ask for their opinion or sharing what is the way forward.
Okay. And what do you think will happen?
Well, I don't know. I think some may agree. Some may agree. Some may say that no, that is not what I experienced.
Okay.
And of course, there could be a worst case that I'm just having it wrong. The worst case is I'm just having it wrong.
Okay. So one possibility is to turn all of this into a positive. So if you think about what frustration means, frustration is my story that things could go faster or they could be simpler. Yeah. So frustration is I feel like things aren't moving fast enough. So it's my emotion, right? It's not that anybody else is necessarily doing anything wrong. It's that for me, it feels like things could move more quickly or more simply. Yeah, that's all. So the only thing I would invite you to look at is to be careful, right? That you're expressing, these are my emotions. It's not about you, right? It's about me. It's about this idea I have that I just keep thinking we might be able to do this more quickly, more simply, more efficiently, but I'm not quite sure how. So tell me what you see. Can you help me figure out how we could do this more quickly or more simply? So what you're doing, what you're making sure not to do, is to blame them for your frustration, right? Because your frustration is yours. And this is where we often go a little bit wrong with emotions, is we tend to blame other people for our emotions. But there are emotions, right? So when I feel frustration, it's because I have a story that things aren't moving quickly enough. But that's my standard. It's not necessarily that anybody is making things go slowly. It's just my energy to get things moving faster. Yeah. So the invitation would be maybe just that, to frame it in that way, because I think the last thing any of us want is to be blamed for other people's emotions. Yeah. Because, right? That just produces other emotions. So let's just finalize this. So you might want to reflect on this, but my question is, if you feel like you're ready, when would you have this conversation with your team?
We do meet every day for a short one. I think I will book a 2-hour session next week. 2-hour session next week.
Okay.
Yeah.
And do you feel prepared to have that conversation?
I feel that rather than feeling frustrated, let's have it clear up, right? Whether is it yeah, I think I'm ready to face the music.
Okay.
Face the music.
Face the music. Dance the dance. Okay. So are you okay to end this conversation here?
Yes. Thank you, Dan.
Okay.
Lovely.
And I want to make an offer to you that if you'd like to be in touch with me and there's something to continue or prepare for that conversation, I'm happy to do that with you, because we've opened a topic here. We only have a little bit of time. I don't want to leave you out there, right? And if there are questions that come up later, or if you want more help preparing for that conversation because it's a new conversation, I'm more than happy to help you. Okay? So you'll get my information. You can be in touch with me, and I want to thank you so much for your participation and volunteering. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So we have a little bit of time, I think, Priya, for questions and answers. If there any in the chat that you'd like to share? I know you're on mute, but in this last 15 minutes,
Yeah.
I'm happy to share anything that comes to mind for people that they would like to know about.
Sure. So there's been a flood of questions and loads of comments, but let's get to the questions because there are some that could be doing with answering. There's
Okay.
a question from Rohini Bhardwaj that says, is emotional intelligence different from emotional literacy?
Well, that was the slide that I was sharing to say that, emotional literacy is a building block. It's a way to access our emotional intelligence. So as we become articulate with emotions through emotional literacy, we can take advantage of our emotional intelligence. And, the thing I notice, I work with a lot of leaders who have done an emotional intelligence assessment and they have their result, but their question is, what do I do with it? And my answer is emotional literacy, right? It doesn't change anything substantially. It doesn't help you become more competent with your emotions to have your assessment results, but it does tell you where to focus your learning. And I think that that's the difference for me, is that we're just learning to read and write, but in the domain of emotions.
And the next one's from Raghunandan. He says, how do we manage emotions when coaching different cultures?
Well, I'm not sure whether he's talking about managing his own or the coachees. One of the things that's so interesting about emotions is that they exist on both sides in coaching, right? So I have my emotions as a coach. The coachee has their emotions. So in preparation for coaching, one of the things I think is really important is that as the coach, I determine what emotion do I want to show up in this coaching. So the ones that serve me very often are compassion, service, a little bit of ambition, right? Let's move forward. Let's not just stay where we are. But the other one, as you saw in the coaching with Suan, is that we both laughed, right? Is that there was a certain amount of irreverence, right? We found things that were actually quite humorous in the coaching. And, when I said, well, what's the outcome going to be? And he laughed. He said, I don't know, because I feel doubt. I never did it before. But, there's a certain amount of lightness too in coaching, I think, because emotions, coaching in general, but emotions can be quite serious for people. And so bringing some irreverence, I think, in a very gentle way can be very helpful. So that's on the coach's side. But on the coachee's side, I think what allows the coaching with emotions is compassion, is whatever emotion the coachee is experiencing is what they're experiencing, right? It's not right or wrong. It's just what they're experiencing. Okay, it's legitimate. And that's my role as a coach, is to legitimize that emotion, let them have their emotional experience, but be curious about it and say, is it really serving you? And if it is, great. If it's not, what are we going to do about it?
Lovely. Shripad Ranade's question is, are emotions and feelings the same thing?
So this is a great question. I tend to think of feelings as the sensations in our body, right? So I feel a knot in my stomach. It's pointing to one or more emotions. It's suggesting them to me, but it's not the emotion itself. So feelings for me, those sensations in our body, are an aspect of emotions. And often when we feel, butterflies in our stomach, we say, oh, I feel anxious, or I feel apprehensive, or I feel nervous. And okay, so they're helping us decode or identify the emotion we're feeling. But everything we feel in our body is not necessarily pointing to an emotion, right? If I cut my finger and it hurts, it may provoke emotions, but it's not telling me about an emotion. It's telling me to pay attention to my body because I cut my finger. So feelings can be focusing, they can be directing us towards emotions or to take care of our body in some way. So I distinguish them, and I don't generally use the word feeling because we use it so generally. Sometimes when we ask people, what do you feel? They say, oh, I think, right? Or they say, I have this emotion, or they say, I'm exhausted. So we use it in lots of vague ways. So I find the word feeling not to be that useful. I prefer to ask people if they can name the emotion that they're experiencing.
Nice. Raghunandan says, how can we avoid emotional questions during the coaching sessions when the coach realizes that the coachee is emotionally not sound to handle the situation?
Well, I think the coach's responsibility is always to meet the coachee where they are. I think that's true in every type of coaching. So when I set up the coaching with someone, I tell them, part of the way I coach is to work with emotions. Now, you decide how much is too much, right? Whether it's in any area. So I have had coachees who are very reluctant to work with emotions or to talk about them. And sometimes it's taken 4 or 5 or 6 sessions before they really begin to feel comfortable enough and safe enough to speak about their emotions. But the thing I would say is to ask and to say, can we investigate that? I think I'm hearing, maybe like I did with Shawan, maybe I'm hearing, a little bit of fear. Could we talk about that? And then trust your coachee. If they say no, then, okay, then it's off limits, as a coach, at least for now. Maybe the next session they'll want to talk about it. But I think we need to be very careful working in this area with our coachees, because if we're very comfortable with emotions, for us, a tiny step may be a leap for our coachees. So I think we need to be very careful. We need to be very attentive and go at their pace. But the more comfortable we are with emotions, the bigger an invitation it is to our coachees. Because if we feel comfortable and we talk about emotions like, well, they're just emotions, if we don't represent them as being highly charged and scary, then actually our coachees will be generally quite calm and be willing to go into the conversation with us. So I would say keep all the rules of coaching and just be very attentive about where your coachee is willing to go and what they say is too much for them.
Lovely. Parijat says, are emotions a result of how we choose to respond to any situation, occurrence in our life?
Well, there's 2 aspects to emotions for me. One is we react. So, if I see something falling in my peripheral vision, right, and I feel fear, I don't think about that. That happens before I can even think about it. So reactions are stimulated by emotions, and those are great because they keep us safe, right? They help us navigate whatever situation we're in. However, with emotions, we also have the opportunity to not just react, but respond. So, for instance, if I feel jealous of my wife, okay, I could react to that, right, which will usually be accusing her of something or trying to hold on or manipulate her or something like that. But a response could be, oh, I'm going to reflect on what would be most effective for my fear of losing the relationship and what would take care of the relationship itself. So I can either react and then respond, or I can, I can stop my reaction or hold it, and I can think, well, I'm going to think about responding to this instead. So I think we have these 2 ways we can come back. We can express an emotion. And I think what most of us have not developed very well is the process of moving from reaction to response. Is that we tend to be quite reactive, but we can learn to respond much more effectively to emotions. It won't get rid of the reaction, but we don't want to get rid of the reaction. It just allows us to be more productive with the emotions.
Lovely, Dan. Anuradha-san, does an emotional state give us irrational responses? Typically, during our amygdala hijack, we are unable to act appropriately. What are your views?
Well, anybody who's been infatuated with another human being, right, another man, another woman, etc., knows that often that's irrational, right? It's not that it makes sense, but we have this tremendous attraction to somebody. So I think, yes, of course, emotions are not rational. That's why we call them irrational. But emotions have a sense of their own, right? They're telling us something else. So our emotion may say, I want to be with this person, but our reason may say, oh no, that's not appropriate. Okay, then we need to resolve that discrepancy or that gap between what we're thinking and what we're feeling, or the emotion that we're experiencing. But I think this is part of emotional navigation, is that, to choose that, well, I feel frustration, but is it appropriate for me to express that? How do I express it, right? And that's the whole conversation I was having with Shuang. So, okay, so I feel frustration. There it is. It's there to help me in some way. What am I going to do with it?
Lovely. Rohini Bhardwaj says, sometimes when we are expressing an emotion, we are aware that it is not appropriate in the moment. So how can we channel that?
Well, the best invention to deal with that is called the apology, which is we say something, we go, oh, that was not appropriate. And then to be easy with an apology, my apology is, it wasn't my intention to, make you uncomfortable or hurt you in any way. And, if I could change it, I would change it. But I think an apology is an extremely useful tool. But I think the other is the reflection and the anticipation of situations. Because if we know that certain situations, or when people say certain things, it triggers an emotion in us that we say something we believe is inappropriate, then we can be aware. We elevate our awareness and we look for those situations. Or we say, you know what, if that person says X, I know how it will affect me, and I'm going to be alert to it, or on guard to it, or I'm going to expect it. And I think that a lot of times that can be extremely helpful. I know that, for me, that's a practice sometimes is, if I'm going into a certain conversation, is, Dan, don't be surprised if this person says X, Y, or Z. And what are you going to do when they say it? Are you going to be silent? Are you just going to say yes? Or are you going to say, okay, how are you going to react or respond to that person saying something that will trigger you?
It's an interesting question that's come from Shripad Ranade. He says the question, what emotion may serve you better, commonly is met with a client's response saying, how can I choose like that artificially? How can we create openness to the idea that emotions can be chosen?
Well, the example I give coachees is, let's imagine you wanted to go on holiday. Okay, so if I asked you, where do you want to go on your holiday? Anywhere in the world, you pick a place you want to go. Anybody can do that, right? Oh, I want to go to Greece. Right? You don't have to know how you're going to get there. You just need to know where you would like to be. Now, that's exactly the analogy I would use for emotion. So if you're in resentment, but you pick any emotion. Oh, well, I think, I'd rather be in joy. Okay. How do you move from resentment to joy? Well, you have to change the story. You also have to change somatically. Your body supports certain emotions. So people don't have to know how to get there. That's part of the coaching process. And for me, it's a completely valid emotion. And one of the things I do is I give people a list of emotions sometimes, or I ask them to go find one, or I give them, the app or a book of mine. And I ask them, go through it and find the emotion that really draws you. What emotion would serve you better? Not just what do you want, but what would serve you better? And just like Shuyan, he didn't have any trouble saying that. He had to reflect on it, and then he said, well, I think a little bit of courage. Oh, okay. Why courage? A little bit of honesty. Oh, okay. Why honesty? A little bit of curiosity. Oh, okay. He knew, right? He just needed somebody to hold the space for him and ask the question so he could take the time to reflect on what were the emotions he thought would serve him better. They weren't my idea, right? They were his idea. He could see them, and he made sense of why those emotions would be helpful. And he even made sense of the practice. What would he do with them? He got quite clear in a very short period of time. And it's not an exception. This is what all my coachees do, is exactly what we did in that coaching happens over and over.
Lovely. We're, almost at the end of time, and there are a couple of more questions. There is one that says here by Priya Ramesh. It says, I'm curious to know, Dan, what did you feel when connection kept going off?
Well, a mix of curiosity, I think confusion, uncertainty. Would he come back? Uncertainty what to say, what to do. Maybe a tiny little bit of frustration. Why is this so difficult? But I work online a lot, so it's not too big of a surprise. But also a certain amount of, I think, empathy or compassion for him, because he's trying to have a coaching session and keeps getting disconnected. So, a whole range of emotions, but yeah, several.
Lovely. So, Dan, this has been such a meaningful session for so many of us, just going through the whole steps, the stages, the historical, how, each of the model you shared, just like so relatable, and especially to see the coaching sessions. Yuan, thank you so much for being there, for allowing us to share your moment, your vulnerability with you. Thank you so much. I'd like to also thank Preeti Gupta, who's been behind the scenes. I'm going to get her on screen for 2 seconds, if she will. Preeti, thank you for managing the slides in the background. And I'm going to get Sion also. Thank you so much for being with us. This was lovely. I just want to thank, all of you for being here, for your participation, your comments, your questions, and generally thank you for, just being and holding the space along with Sean. Thank you very much, everyone. This has been an absolute pleasure. Dan, thank you for being here.
Thank
Sean,
you.
thank you for being here with us and showing, your vulnerability and also your willingness to have all the courage to share. And Preeti, thank you for coordinating in the background. It's lovely.
Thank you.